During a violent storm, a chance rescue leads to an unexpected connection that defies social boundaries. Within rehabilitation centers and luxury estates, two souls from different worlds find their fates intertwined. Between lightning strikes and love's spark lies a story that proves some storms bring more than rain. As recovery progresses, true healing begins in unexpected ways. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at Elias's threadbare jacket. Rain lashed down, a relentless icy curtain obscuring the already blurred world. He hunched deeper into the alleyway. The stench of rotting refuse a familiar comfort compared to the gnawing emptiness inside. His knuckles, raw from years of fighting, were white as he gripped a rusty pipe, a pathetic shield against the storm raging both outside and within. Lightning split the sky, illuminating his face gaunt, etched with the weariness of a life lived on the edge. Another crack of thunder echoed the raw pain that pulsed in his chest, a constant reminder of the things he couldn't outrun, couldn't escape. The storm mirrored his internal chaos. Each gust of wind was a memory, each flash of lightning a sharp, searing revelation of his past mistakes. He closed his eyes, the images, blurred faces, harsh words, the chilling memory of cold steel, assaulting his senses. He was trapped, adrift in a tempest of his own making, and the storm outside only intensified his despair. He felt utterly alone, swallowed whole by the darkness. Then, a flicker of movement through the driving rain, a flash of expensive silk, a terrified gasp. Anya. He barely registered her at first, a fleeting image amidst the chaos. Then, a cry, a desperate plea swallowed by the wind. She was stumbling, caught in the deluge, her elegant clothes plastered to her body, her face a mask of sheer terror. Elias hesitated, his ingrained cynicism battling with a flicker of something else, a primal instinct to protect. He'd never rescued anyone before. "Need help?" she gasped, her voice barely audible above the storm's roar. Her eyes, wide and luminous even in the dim light, held a vulnerability that disarmed him. He saw her fear, raw and untainted by the callousness he'd grown accustomed to. It was a stark contrast to the hardened shell he'd built around himself. "Get behind the dumpster," he grunted, his voice rough, a jarring contrast to her refined accent. He was surprised at his own words. He hadn't intended to help, not really. But the sight of her terror had somehow pierced his armor. The storm raged on, but in the small space between the wall and the dumpster, a strange sort of calm settled, a fragile truce amidst the chaos. Their first encounter, brief and fraught with danger, marked the beginning of a connection that would defy all odds. The rescue was a turning point, a shared vulnerability in the eye of the storm. The sterile scent of antiseptic fought with the lingering smell of rain on Anya's clothes. Her arm, encased in a pristine white cast, felt heavy, a stark contrast to the lightness of her silk blouse, now replaced by a hospital gown. The soft hum of the machines monitoring her vitals was a constant, unsettling reminder of her vulnerability. She stared out the window, the city lights blurring through the rain-streaked glass, a million distant points of light mocking her isolation. Elias sat beside her, his large hands clasped loosely in his lap, his gaze fixed on the floor. The hospital room felt too small, too clean for him, a world away from the grimy alleys he called home. He shifted uncomfortably, the crispness of the borrowed shirt chafing against his skin. Anya broke the silence, her voice fragile. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. The gratitude in her eyes was palpable, a stark contrast to the initial fear that had dominated their first encounter. Elias grunted, a low rumble in his chest. "Don't mention it." He avoided her gaze, his usual cynicism battling with a nascent sense of unease. He wasn't used to gratitude, especially not from someone like her. He felt acutely aware of the chasm separating their worlds, a gulf wider than the storm-ravaged streets outside. A wave of nausea rolled over Anya, the memory of the storm's fury, the icy grip of fear, the blinding flash of lightning. It all came flooding back, sharp and vivid. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the already hazy cityscape. It was terrifying, she breathed, her voice trembling. The composure she usually maintained, the carefully constructed facade of her privileged life, had crumbled under the onslaught of the storm and the subsequent trauma. Elias watched her silently, a flicker of empathy softening the harsh lines of his face. He understood terror. He lived with it. He knew the paralyzing grip of fear, the icy dread that clung to him like a second skin. He reached out a calloused hand, hesitant, then rested it gently on hers, offering a silent reassurance. The unexpected touch startled her at first, but she didn't pull away. In that shared silence, in the simple gesture, a fragile bridge began to form across the vast chasm that divided them. The storm had passed, but its aftermath was only just beginning. Days bled into weeks. Anya's luxurious rehabilitation center, a sanctuary of polished marble and hushed whispers, felt like a gilded cage. The scent of expensive flowers and antiseptic couldn't mask the underlying anxiety that clung to her like a shadow. Physical therapy was grueling, each movement a painful reminder of the storm's brutal impact. Emotionally, she was adrift, the familiar comfort of her privileged world replaced by a disconcerting vulnerability. She found herself thinking of Elias, the unexpected rescuer, his rough hands surprisingly gentle in the chaotic aftermath. Her family's visits were strained. Her mother, a vision of controlled composure in designer suits, offered polite concern tinged with thinly veiled disapproval. Her father, preoccupied with business and damage control, barely registered her presence. Only her younger brother, Liam, seemed genuinely concerned, his youthful exuberance muted by the gravity of the situation. He'd pressed her for details about Elias, his curiosity piqued by this unlikely hero who emerged from the storm's wreckage. One afternoon, a small, worn photograph slipped from Anya's bedside table. It showed a younger Elias, a boy with bright, defiant eyes, a stark contrast to the hardened young man she knew. Liam had been rummaging through a basket of Anya's belongings, collecting items to cheer her up. He picked up the photograph, a frown furrowing his brow. "Who's this?" he asked, his voice hushed. Anya hesitated. Sharing this with her family seemed impossible. Yet the image stirred a poignant curiosity within her. The worn edges of the photograph, the faded colors, spoke of a life utterly different from her own, yet strangely compelling. This is Elias," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The man who saved me." The admission hung in the air, fragile and unsettling. Liam's eyes widened, a mixture of surprise and respect clouding his usually cheerful expression. The silence that followed held a weight far heavier than the anxieties that plagued her. In that shared moment of silent understanding, Anya began to truly contemplate the bridge that had been formed, fragile as it was, between her world and Elias. The storm had shattered more than just her physical well-being. It had shattered the carefully constructed walls of her privileged existence, revealing a vulnerability that left her both frightened and strangely excited about the possibilities ahead. The sterile scent of antiseptic battled with the faint, lingering smell of rain clinging to Elias's clothes. He sat hunched on the hard plastic chair, the fluorescent lights of the public hospital hallway buzzing overhead like angry wasps. His knuckles, raw and scraped from the storm, were still throbbing. He'd saved Anya, a fact that felt both monumental and strangely insignificant, swallowed by the vastness of his own internal turmoil. The storm, he thought, had been a mirror reflecting his inner chaos. A nurse bustled past, her crisp white uniform a stark contrast to the grime clinging to his worn jeans. He flinched, pulling his threadbare jacket tighter around him. He felt exposed, vulnerable. The heroism he'd been lauded with felt like a flimsy cloak, easily ripped away, revealing the scarred man beneath. Anya, he knew, was in a completely different world. A world of sterile white rooms, soft blankets, and concerned whispers. He imagined her, her delicate hands tended to by gloved nurses, the worry etched on her face replaced with the calm assurance of her privileged life slowly returning. The thought sparked a bitter resentment in him, a familiar knot of anger tightening in his chest. It wasn't fair. His world was harsh, unforgiving. Hers was cushioned, protected. Yet, they had shared a moment of terrifying vulnerability, a bond forged in the heart of the storm. He shifted, the discomfort of the chair mirroring the unease in his soul. He glanced at the chipped paint on the wall, the peeling wallpaper a metaphor for the cracks in his own carefully constructed defenses. The storm had cracked them open, exposing the raw, broken man beneath. The rescue hadn't been just physical. It had been a crack in the wall of his hardened cynicism, a whisper of something he hadn't felt in years, hope. Suddenly, a doctor approached, his eyes holding a mixture of concern and weariness. "Elias," the doctor said, his voice low, "they've requested you to visit Miss Albright." Elias felt a jolt of surprise, then a surge of apprehension. Anya's family. He pictured her father, his face grim, his eyes calculating. He knew this wouldn't be easy. "Visit?" he asked, his voice rough. The doctor nodded, a sympathetic expression on his face. "They want to thank you personally," he explained, "but they're understandably concerned about the circumstances." Elias swallowed, the lump in his throat growing larger. The circumstances. He knew exactly what that meant. The stark contrast between their lives, the chasm that separated them, the unspoken judgments that loomed between them. This visit, he realized, wasn't just a thank you. It was a test of their fragile connection, a test of how far their worlds could possibly bridge. The storm may have brought them together, but the aftermath might tear them apart. He rose, the hard chair creaking a protest under his weight. He felt a tremor of fear, a subtle flicker of doubt, but beneath it all, a spark of defiance burned. He would face them. He would face this test. For Anya, and perhaps for himself. The private room was a stark contrast to the harsh fluorescent glare of the public hospital. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a suite furnished with calming pastels and the scent of expensive lilies. Anya lay in a plush bed, her arm in a sling, her face pale but composed. She looked smaller, more vulnerable than the fiery woman he'd pulled from the raging storm. Elias shifted awkwardly, his worn jeans feeling out of place amidst the polished elegance. "Thank you," Anya whispered, her voice frail. Her eyes, usually sparkling with vivacity, held a shadow of fear. Elias mumbled a response, his throat constricted. He felt the weight of her family's scrutiny, the silent judgment hanging in the air thicker than the lily fragrance. Mr. Albright, his face a mask of controlled anger, sat stiffly in a nearby armchair. His wife, a vision of icy composure, watched them both with hawk-like intensity. "It was an accident," Elias said, his voice rougher than he intended. He avoided their gaze, focusing on the intricate pattern of the Persian rug beneath his boots. He felt utterly exposed, his rough hands a stark contrast to the pristine environment. "An accident that saved our daughter's life," Mr. Albright stated, his tone devoid of warmth. "We are grateful, of course." The "of course" dripped with sarcasm. Anya's mother finally spoke, her voice laced with a cool politeness that felt more like a threat. "We understand you've had some difficulties in the past. We want to ensure Anya's recovery isn't compromised." The unspoken accusation hung in the air, sharp and precise. Elias felt a familiar anger rising, a cold fist clenching in his gut. He opened his mouth to retort, but Anya's hand, pale and delicate, rested lightly on his arm. He looked down, surprised by the unexpected touch, the warmth a small counterpoint to the chilly atmosphere. "He's been very brave," Anya said softly, her voice gaining strength. She looked at her parents, her gaze unwavering. "He saved my life." There was a quiet defiance in her tone, a nascent rebellion against their unspoken judgment. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words, a battlefield of differing worlds. The sunlight, once comforting, now felt like a spotlight, highlighting the chasm between them. Elias saw a flicker of something uncertainty, perhaps even a hint of doubt in Mr. Albright's eyes. The storm had brought them together. The aftermath was testing their resilience, a tempest of its own kind. And he knew, with a sudden certainty, that he wouldn't let them tear them apart. The days bled into weeks. Anya's recovery, swift in its physical aspects, lagged emotionally. The opulent rehabilitation center, a gilded cage, offered little solace. Sunlight, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a spotlight on her vulnerability. Elias, meanwhile, navigated the harsh reality of his own public rehabilitation center. The sterile environment mirrored the coldness he carried within. He'd seen glimpses of Anya, a fleeting image through a window, a whispered name from a nurse, but direct contact remained elusive. The chasm between their worlds felt insurmountable. One rainy afternoon, defying both rules and expectations, Elias found himself at the gates of Anya's center. He hesitated, the wrought iron gates gleaming like a forbidding barrier. The scent of rain-soaked earth clashed with the lingering perfume of lilies from his last visit. He'd brought a small, battered book, a collection of poetry he'd found in a forgotten corner of his center's library. He imagined her, pale and fragile, surrounded by the opulence that felt alien to him. His heart hammered against his ribs, a chaotic rhythm mirroring the storm brewing inside him. He finally found Anya sitting alone in the meticulously manicured gardens, her gaze lost in the distance. Seeing him, a flicker of surprise, then a hesitant smile, crossed her face. "Elias," she breathed, her voice barely audible above the gentle patter of rain. He approached cautiously, his worn boots crunching on the gravel path. The contrast between his clothes and the surroundings was sharp, yet today it seemed less important than the shared unspoken understanding in their eyes. He handed her the book. "I thought you might like this," he mumbled, his hands clumsy and unsure. Anya took it gently, her fingers brushing his. A spark, small but potent, ignited between them. The rain continued to fall, a soft counterpoint to the growing warmth between them. They spoke in hushed tones, their conversation a delicate dance between two worlds. Anya spoke of her fear, of the overwhelming isolation despite the constant presence of her family. Elias revealed a sliver of his past, a fleeting glimpse of the pain that had shaped him. The silence between their words was not awkward. It held a profound intimacy. The garden, shrouded in mist and rain, felt like a sanctuary, a space where their shared vulnerability transcended the boundaries of their vastly different worlds. They knew the risk. The precarious balance of their stolen moment was a fragile thing, easily shattered. Yet, in that shared quietude, something profound bloomed. A connection deeper than the storm that brought them together, stronger than the worlds that sought to keep them apart. The following weeks were a blur of stolen moments. Anya's opulent rehabilitation center, with its sterile scent of antiseptic and lilies, felt a world away from Elias's gritty public facility, redolent of disinfectant and stale coffee. Yet, they found each other in the quiet spaces between the chaos of their respective recoveries. Their meetings were clandestine, brief encounters in the hushed corners of the hospital gardens, a shared silence more eloquent than words. One afternoon, Anya found Elias sitting on a damp bench, the rain a relentless curtain around them. He was sketching in a worn notebook, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up, startled, a flicker of something akin to guilt in his eyes. The rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead, accentuating the sharp angles of his face. I didn't know you came here," Anya whispered, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. He offered a small, hesitant smile. "Sometimes, this is quieter than my place." He gestured to the notebook, trying to capture the storm. "It's easier than remembering things." Anya sat beside him, the damp seeping into her expensive clothes. She didn't care. She reached out, her fingers brushing his, a silent acknowledgement of their shared vulnerability. The touch sent a shiver down his spine, a stark contrast to the chill of the rain. "It's beautiful," she murmured, her gaze fixed on his sketch. "It captures the feeling of that night, the fear, the chaos." He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. "And the hope," he added softly, his voice rough but gentle. "The hope that someone would be there." The unspoken hung between them, thick and heavy with the weight of their shared experience. The storm, a force of nature that had almost claimed their lives, had instead forged a fragile, unexpected bond. They sat in companionable silence, the rain a constant rhythm, a soundtrack to their unspoken connection. The scent of wet earth and petrichor filled the air, a fragrant reminder of the night that had changed everything. The weight of their contrasting worlds seemed to lessen, replaced by the quiet understanding that bloomed between them amidst the falling rain. Their fingers intertwined, a silent promise whispered against the backdrop of the storm's lingering memory. The sterile scent of Anya's rehabilitation center clashed violently with the memory of the storm's earthy fragrance. She traced the delicate scar above her eyebrow, a pale line against her porcelain skin, a constant reminder of the night Elias saved her. The opulent room, filled with soft light and expensive art, felt like a cage. A knock. Her heart quickened. It wasn't her therapist. It was him. Elias stood awkwardly in the doorway, his worn jeans and simple shirt a stark contrast to the plush surroundings. He clutched a small, wilted bouquet of wildflowers, a stark, beautiful defiance of the sterile elegance of the room. I shouldn't be here," he mumbled, his gaze flitting around the room. "But you are," Anya replied softly, her voice betraying a tremor of excitement and guilt. She felt a thrill, a dangerous spark in the face of her family's disapproval. He stepped inside, his eyes lingering on the scar above her eyebrow. "It's healing well," he whispered, his voice husky. "It's a reminder," she said, her voice catching slightly. "A reminder of the storm, and of you." She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. It was a risk, defying her family's silent disapproval, the chasm of their different worlds. Elias approached, his hands hesitant. He offered the wildflowers. I found them near the creek. They reminded me of you." The simple gesture held an unexpected weight. He seemed to be fighting against himself, the cynicism that usually shielded him cracking beneath the weight of his feelings. Anya took the flowers, the delicate petals soft against her skin. "Thank you," she whispered, her fingers brushing his. A silent understanding passed between them, a shared vulnerability that transcended the walls separating their lives. The air crackled with unspoken emotions, a dangerous, exhilarating energy. The rain, a shared trauma, had given birth to something beautiful, fragile, and undeniably real. The weight of their differing worlds, for a moment, felt insignificant. The humid air hung heavy in the sterile hospital corridor. Anya, her arm in a sling, watched Elias from behind the visitors' waiting area glass. He sat hunched in a plastic chair, his gaze fixed on the worn linoleum floor. The fluorescent lights seemed to amplify the harshness of his features, the shadows deepening the lines etched around his eyes. He looked exhausted, the raw energy he'd shown during the rescue replaced by a bone-deep weariness. Anya felt a pang of guilt. His heroism had been overshadowed by her privileged position, her family's hushed conversations whispering of insurance claims and legal protection, a world utterly alien to Elias's reality. She saw him as he really was, not a rescuer in a dramatic narrative, but a young man bearing the scars of a life lived on the harsh edges of society. The door to the adjoining room opened, revealing a nurse. Elias stood, his movements stiff, and followed her inside. Anya watched him disappear, a wave of conflicting emotions washing over her. He hadn't looked at her, hadn't acknowledged her presence. Was he avoiding her? Or was it simply the vast chasm of their different worlds yawning between them, silencing them both? The hospital buzzed with activity. The low hum of machines, the hushed tones of doctors, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on polished floors. A symphony of sounds that felt utterly incongruous with the wild storm they'd both survived. The memories of that night, of the raging wind and torrential rain, the fear and desperation, were visceral, raw. Yet, within that chaos, a spark had ignited, a fragile connection between two souls seemingly from opposite ends of the earth. The memory of his hand gripping hers, the raw strength in his gaze, burned bright in her mind. Later, Anya's family visited, their concern laced with thinly veiled anxiety about the scandal, the potential damage to their reputation. Their hushed words, their furtive glances towards the door, felt like a suffocating blanket. She longed to tell them about Elias, about the quiet strength he possessed, the deep empathy that lay beneath his hardened exterior. But the unspoken rules of their world prevented her. The weight of their disapproval settled upon her, a heavy stone in her chest. She looked at her reflection in the polished surface of a bedside table, the faint scar above her eyebrow a stark reminder of the night the storm brought them together, and how different their paths were. She wondered if Elias would even try to see her again. The silence was deafening, a chasm mirrored by the yawning distance between their lives, a terrifying reality that threatened to extinguish the fragile spark ignited during the storm. The sterile scent of antiseptic battled the lingering smell of rain clinging to Elias's clothes. He sat on the hard plastic chair, the cold seeping into his bones, a mirror of the chill that had settled in his heart. Anya's image, a fleeting glimpse through the glass, flickered in his mind, the delicate curve of her brow, the subtle tremor in her hand as she'd clutched his. He'd felt her fear, raw and palpable, a stark contrast to the icy detachment he usually wore as armor. The nurse, a woman with kind eyes and a weary smile, entered, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. "Mr. Thorne," she said gently, her voice a soothing balm against the harshness of the room. "Your doctor wants to see you." He nodded, his throat tight, the words catching. He couldn't shake the image of Anya's family, their hushed whispers carrying the weight of unspoken judgments. Their world, a world of privilege and polished surfaces, felt as distant and cold as the Antarctic winds. His own world, a bleak landscape of broken promises and shattered trust, felt equally unforgiving. He followed the nurse, the rhythmic beat of his own heart a counterpoint to the low hum of the hospital machines. The doctor's office was small, impersonal, the scent of antiseptic even stronger here. The doctor, a man with tired eyes and a sympathetic frown, explained the course of treatment, his words blurring into a meaningless drone. Elias barely listened, his mind still clinging to the memory of Anya's frightened eyes. Later, outside the hospital, the city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windows of the bus. He stared at his reflection, a gaunt face framed by unruly dark hair, eyes that held the weight of unspoken burdens. The hero label felt like a cruel joke, a hollow title draped over a man still grappling with his own demons. He wondered if Anya would ever look at him again, not as a rescuer, but as a man deserving of compassion, of understanding. The rain lashed against the bus window, a rhythmic drumming that mirrored the relentless pounding of his heart. He pulled his collar higher, a silent plea for refuge from the storm that raged within and without. The fragile connection forged in the heart of the tempest seemed to hang precariously, threatened by the vast chasm of their different worlds. Would their shared experience be enough to bridge the divide? Or would the storm that brought them together ultimately tear them apart? The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and fear. Anya, pale and still, lay in the bed, her breath shallow. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound besides the muffled sobs escaping her mother, a vision of elegant despair in a silk robe. Elias stood awkwardly by the door, his worn jeans and battered jacket a stark contrast to the sterile environment. He felt the weight of their gazes, their silent accusations as heavy as the rain that still lashed against the windows. She's going to be all right," he offered, his voice rough and used to the hushed tones of the hospital. The words felt inadequate, pathetic even to him. Anya's mother, a woman whose face usually shone with carefully applied makeup, now looked gaunt and drawn. "All right?" she breathed, her voice laced with disbelief. "My daughter almost died, Mr. Thorne, because of a storm." The unspoken accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Elias shifted his weight, the floor cold against his worn boots. He wanted to explain, to tell them how the chaos of the storm had sharpened his instincts, how he'd pulled her from the raging river, a near-impossible feat driven by adrenaline and something akin to instinct. But the words caught in his throat. He knew they wouldn't understand. Their world was one of controlled environments, of meticulously planned lives. His was a world where survival was a daily struggle. Anya stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She saw him standing there, silhouetted against the pale light of the window, and a faint smile touched her lips. "Elias," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with a gratitude that warmed him more than any praise ever could. Her mother's gasp was sharp, a brittle sound that echoed the fragility of their newfound connection. The unspoken battle lines were drawn, a silent war between two worlds, two vastly different perspectives on survival and grace. Elias knew with a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. The storm had passed, but the tempest within their lives was just brewing. The shared trauma, the brief connection forged in the heart of the storm, felt already threatened by the icy walls of societal divisions. He looked at Anya, her fragile strength a beacon in the sterile gloom of the hospital, and knew his fight for her, for their connection, had just begun. The antiseptic tang of the hospital filled Anya's nostrils, a stark contrast to the scent of rain and river mud still clinging to Elias's clothes. He stood awkwardly, his large hands shoved deep in his pockets, a picture of uncomfortable stillness. The rhythmic beeping of Anya's heart monitor pulsed in the tense silence, a counterpoint to the erratic beat of her mother's heart, visible beneath the silk of her robe. Anya's eyes, a startling shade of blue against her pale skin, flickered open. She focused on Elias, a flicker of recognition softening the lingering haze of pain. A faint smile touched her lips, a fragile bloom amidst the sterile environment. "Elias," she whispered, her voice raspy, yet carrying a weight of gratitude that resonated in the silent room. Her mother's gasp cut through the quiet, sharp and brittle, like the cracking of ice. The unspoken accusations hung heavy in the air, the tension thick enough to choke on. Elias felt the weight of their scrutiny, the chasm that separated their worlds widening with each passing second. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain the frantic scramble through the storm, the desperate grip on her hand, the adrenaline-fueled instinct that had driven him to save her. But the words caught in his throat, choked by the suffocating awareness of their differences. He saw the fear in her mother's eyes, a fear not of the storm, but of him, of his rough hands, his worn clothes, his life so utterly alien to hers. He saw the subtle shift in Anya's expression, the shadow of doubt clouding the gratitude in her eyes. The unspoken question hung between them. Could this connection, forged in the crucible of a storm, truly survive the harsh realities of their different worlds? The storm had passed, leaving behind a fragile peace, a delicate balance easily shattered by the icy winds of societal expectations. The rescue had brought them together, but the aftermath threatened to tear them apart. The real storm, Elias realized, had only just begun. The sterile scent of antiseptic battled with the lingering smell of rain clinging to Elias's worn jacket. He shifted uncomfortably, the hospital gown feeling alien against his skin. Anya's mother, a vision of controlled fury in silk robes, watched him with undisguised suspicion, her gaze sharp and assessing. Anya, pale but conscious, lay in the bed, her breathing shallow, a thin white sheet pulled up to her chin. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound besides the faint whirring of machinery. "He saved me," Anya whispered, her voice thin but clear, a fragile bridge thrown across the chasm of their different worlds. Her gaze, though weak, held a steadfast certainty. Her mother's gasp was sharp, a brittle sound that echoed the tension in the room. "Saved you? He's a vagrant, a drifter." The words were laced with disdain, each syllable a tiny shard of ice. Elias's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, the words he'd rehearsed 100 times catching in his throat. He wanted to explain the chaotic rush of the storm, the instinctive leap to pull her from the raging current, the desperate grip of her hand in his. But the words felt clumsy, inadequate in the face of her mother's icy disapproval. Anya's mother moved closer to the bed, her voice softening. yet still laced with a chilling control. "Sweetheart, you're still weak. You need rest. We'll deal with this incident later." The emphasis on the word incident was deliberate, minimizing his heroic act to a mere occurrence. Elias felt the sting of injustice. He was used to being dismissed, overlooked, but seeing the uncertainty flicker in Anya's eyes, a subtle hesitation replacing the earlier gratitude, wounded him. He felt the weight of their different worlds, the insurmountable gulf between his rough life and hers. The shared vulnerability of the storm seemed a distant memory, replaced by the cold reality of social divisions. The silence hung heavy, thick with unspoken accusations and simmering resentment. The rescue, a moment of shared peril and fragile connection, now seemed like a distant dream, its aftermath a bitter awakening. The storm might have passed, but a new, colder storm was brewing. The sterile scent of antiseptic, a stark contrast to the lingering petrichor clinging to Elias's clothes, filled the small hospital room. Anya, her face pale but her eyes bright with an unsettling mixture of fear and gratitude, clutched a thin blanket around her. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor pulsed in the tense silence, a counterpoint to the storm raging outside, now a distant, muffled roar. "He saved me," Anya repeated, her voice barely a whisper, yet carrying a surprising strength. Her gaze, locking with Elias's, held a flicker of defiance directed at her mother, who stood rigidly by the door, her silk robe shimmering like a disapproving shroud. Mrs. Beaumont's voice, when it came, was a carefully modulated weapon. "He's a fortunate young man," she corrected, her tone laced with ice. "Coincidence, really? Pure chance." The dismissal hung in the air, heavier than the lingering scent of rain. Elias felt the familiar sting of injustice, but this time, it was different. It wasn't just the usual indifference. It was the blatant disregard for the very real danger they'd shared, the shared vulnerability that had briefly connected them. Anya shifted, wincing slightly. The thin blanket offered little comfort. "Mother," she protested weakly, her voice laced with exhaustion. "He risked his own life. He pulled me from the water." Mrs. Beaumont's expression softened fractionally, but only fractionally. "Of course, darling, but we must be practical. This incident requires discretion. There will be compensation, naturally." The word compensation felt like another slap, a transactional reduction of a life-saving act. It underscored the immense gulf between their worlds, a gulf far deeper than the raging river Elias had pulled Anya from. Elias, his gaze fixed on Anya's pale face, felt a surge of anger. He wanted to speak, to lash out at the casual dismissal of his heroism. But he knew his words would be swallowed by her mother's wealth and influence. He saw Anya's face fall. The faint hope that had flickered in her eyes moments before began to dim, replaced by a growing weariness. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could utter a word, Anya reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she grasped his. Her fingers intertwined with his, a small act of defiance that spoke volumes. A silent acknowledgement of a shared experience that transcended their vastly different realities. The silent connection was a defiant bridge against the cold storm brewing between them and the Beaumont family. The heart monitor continued its steady beat, a rhythmic pulse of life amidst the silent tension. The sterile hospital room felt colder than the storm outside. Anya's pale face, etched with exhaustion, was illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights, highlighting the faint tremor in her hand as she clutched Elias's. The scent of antiseptic battled with the lingering dampness of rain clinging to Elias's clothes, a stark reminder of their shared ordeal. Mrs. Beaumont, a vision of icy composure in her silk robe, remained a sentinel by the door, her disapproval radiating like heat from a furnace. "Mother," Anya whispered, her voice raspy. "He saved me." Mrs. Beaumont's voice, impeccably controlled, sliced through the silence. "Indeed, darling, a fortunate coincidence. We shall, of course, compensate him appropriately." The word compensate hung in the air, heavy and cold, a stark contrast to the warmth of Anya's hand in Elias's. He felt a simmering anger, a familiar injustice, But this time, it was laced with a bitter taste of betrayal. This wasn't just about the money. It was about the casual dismissal of the raw, shared terror, the fragile connection forged in the heart of the storm. Elias opened his mouth to protest, but Anya squeezed his hand, a silent plea to stay calm. Her eyes, though still haunted by fear, held a spark of defiance, a flicker of understanding that transcended the vast chasm between their worlds. He saw the unspoken plea in her eyes, the silent acknowledgement of a bond forged in chaos. He felt the weight of her trust, a heavy responsibility. The anger, though still simmering, was tempered by a newfound protectiveness. He looked at Anya, truly saw her vulnerability, her fragility beneath the veneer of wealth and privilege. This wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something unexpected, something far more significant than Mrs. Beaumont's cold calculations. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, a relentless reminder of Anya's near-death experience, pulsed in the tense silence, a stark counterpoint to the quiet defiance that now simmered between him and Mrs. Beaumont. The unspoken words hung heavier than the storm clouds lingering on the horizon. The rescue was over, but the battle for their connection had only just begun. The antiseptic smell stung Elias's nostrils, a harsh counterpoint to the lingering scent of rain on his clothes. He watched Anya, her face pale but resolute, her hand still gripping his. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was a relentless drumbeat in the tense silence. Mrs. Beaumont's disapproval hung heavy in the air, a tangible thing, thick as the storm clouds still clinging to the horizon. "Mother?" Anya repeated, her voice stronger now, a fragile defiance replacing the earlier rasp. "He saved my life." Mrs. Beaumont's perfectly sculpted lips thinned. "Indeed, and we shall ensure he's adequately compensated." The word, dripping with condescension, felt like a slap. Elias's jaw tightened. The simmering anger threatened to boil over. This wasn't about money. It was about the callous disregard for the shared terror, the unspoken connection forged in the heart of the storm. He wanted to lash out, to tell her how easily she dismissed the raw, visceral fear they'd both faced. But Anya's grip on his hand tightened. Her eyes, though still shadowed with exhaustion, held a fierce spark of protectiveness, a silent plea for understanding. He saw it, the fear, yes, but also a nascent understanding that their worlds, so vastly different, had somehow collided and created something fragile yet powerful. A nurse bustled in, checking Anya's vitals. The brief interruption broke the tension, but the underlying current remained. As the nurse left, Anya's gaze, intense and unwavering, met Elias's. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the steady beep. The words, simple yet profound, carried the weight of her gratitude, her vulnerability, her unspoken acknowledgement of their shared experience. Elias felt the familiar wall around his heart begin to crack. Her words were a balm, soothing the burn of Mrs. Beaumont's coldness. He couldn't articulate the complex emotions swirling inside him: anger, gratitude, a burgeoning protectiveness that surprised even him. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise, a silent acknowledgement of the bond forged in the chaos of the storm. The hospital room, previously sterile and cold, felt slightly less so now, warmed by the unspoken connection, the shared understanding that transcended the gulf between their worlds. The rescue was over, but their story, their battle, was just beginning. The rehabilitation center shimmered with sterile luxury. Anya, swathed in silk sheets, stared out the expansive window, the city a blurry watercolor of gray and gold. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a sky washed clean, mirroring the conflicted state of her soul. The opulent room felt like a gilded cage, its quiet opulence a stark contrast to the terrifying chaos of the storm. Her arm, still bandaged, throbbed a dull ache, a constant reminder of her vulnerability. Elias's face flickered in her memory. His grim determination, the intensity in his eyes, a warmth, unexpected and unwelcome, spread through her chest. A soft knock. Her mother entered, her expression carefully neutral, yet her eyes held a familiar coolness. "Darling," Mrs. Beaumont began, her voice silken but firm. "The doctors are pleased with your progress." The words felt laced with something else. A subtle reprimand, a carefully veiled disapproval. "But the young man who rescued you, we've arranged for a suitable compensation. We must maintain a certain decorum." Anya's heart sank. It wasn't just money. It was the dismissal of Elias's courage, the ignoring of the bond forged in fear and shared survival. "Mother," Anya said, her voice trembling slightly, "he saved my life." The words hung in the air, fragile but resolute. The unspoken plea for understanding, for acknowledgement of something beyond monetary transactions, was lost on her mother. Mrs. Beaumont's composure wavered only slightly. "Of course, darling, but such associations are impractical." The polite dismissal felt like a cruel blow. Anya's gaze fell to her bandaged arm. The physical pain felt minor compared to the emotional wound. Her mother's cool detachment was more frightening than the storm. The luxury around her felt suffocating, a symbol of the distance that was being forced between her and a lifeline she had found in the most unexpected place. The fluorescent lights of the public rehabilitation center hummed a monotonous tune, a stark contrast to the hushed luxury of Anya's facility. Elias sat on a worn plastic chair, the metallic tang of antiseptic clinging to the air. He traced the faded scars on his knuckles, a roadmap of past fights, past hurts. His therapist, a kind woman with tired eyes, sat opposite him, her presence a silent invitation to delve into the darkness he usually kept locked away. The storm, he realized, hadn't just damaged his body. It had cracked open a dam of suppressed emotions. The rescue, it changed things, didn't it? Dr. Ramirez asked softly, her voice cutting through the silence. Elias shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "It just happened. Anya was there. I saved her." He kept his tone flat, refusing to acknowledge the tremor in his voice. He felt a knot tighten in his chest, a familiar feeling, the tightening of his fists before a fight. This was a different kind of battle, though, a battle against his own demons. And how did that feel? Dr. Ramirez pressed gently. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken significance. It wasn't just about the physical act of saving her. It was about the connection, about the shared vulnerability in the face of the storm's fury. He thought of Anya's wide, frightened eyes, the delicate tremor in her hands as she clutched his. He thought of the warmth of her skin against his as he pulled her from the raging water. A warmth that had nothing to do with the cold rain. A flicker of something unfamiliar, guilt, perhaps, or something softer, something closer to regret for his own hardened heart. It was a feeling he wasn't equipped to handle, a feeling that threatened to unravel him. "It felt different," he finally mumbled, the words escaping like a sigh. He looked up, meeting Dr. Ramirez's compassionate gaze. "Different from anything I've ever felt." He felt a tear trace a path down his cheek, a silent acknowledgement of the emotional turmoil raging within him. The storm outside might have subsided, but the tempest inside him was only just beginning. The scent of lilies, cloyingly sweet, hung heavy in the air of Anya's rehabilitation suite. Sunlight, filtered through gauzy curtains, cast a warm glow on the polished mahogany furniture. But the opulence felt suffocating to Anya. The quiet hum of expensive machinery monitoring her vital signs was a constant reminder of her fragility. Her mother, elegantly dressed despite the early hour, sat stiffly on a plush armchair, a magazine clutched in her perfectly manicured hand. "Elias visited again, didn't he?" Her mother's voice, though seemingly calm, held an edge of steel. Anya flinched, her gaze dropping to the intricate floral pattern on her silk bedspread. "Yes, mother," she replied softly, her voice barely a whisper. Shame washed over her. She hadn't told her mother the full extent of their encounters. "He's not suitable, Anya. You must understand that." Her mother's voice sharpened. "He's from a completely different world." Anya's eyes filled with unshed tears. "He saved my life, mother. He's kind." The words trailed off, inadequate to express the depth of her feelings. The memory of his calloused hands, so gentle as they'd cradled her injured head, flooded back, a stark contrast to the clinical sterility of her current surroundings. Her mother sighed dramatically. "Kindness doesn't pay the bills, darling, and certainly doesn't erase the differences." The unspoken words hung in the air. Class, background, life choices. Anya closed her eyes, the weight of her mother's disapproval heavy on her chest. She pictured Elias's face, the lines etched deep by hardship, but his smile, when it came, lighting up his entire being. The contrast between the worlds they inhabited was vast, a chasm that seemed insurmountable. Yet, within the heart of that storm, a connection had been forged, stronger and deeper than she ever could have imagined. A connection she wasn't prepared to let go of. The battle for her heart had begun. The sterile scent of antiseptic battled with the faint, lingering sweetness of lilies in Anya's room. Sunlight, a pale imitation of the storm's ferocious energy, barely penetrated the thick curtains. She traced the intricate floral pattern on her silk duvet, its delicate beauty a mockery of her fractured state. The rhythmic beep of her heart monitor was a relentless counterpoint to the silence, a constant reminder of her fragility. Anya stared out the window, the sprawling estate's manicured lawns a stark contrast to the ravaged landscape she remembered from the night of the storm. The memory of Elias's strong hands pulling her from the raging torrent, the raw fear in his eyes mirroring her own, flooded her consciousness. Her mother's disapproval hung heavy, a physical weight on her chest. "He's different," her mother had repeated, the words echoing in Anya's mind. Different wasn't just a difference in social standing. It was a chasm carved by years of hardship and privilege. Yet, in that chasm, a fragile bridge had been built, a bond forged in the heart of a storm. A tear escaped, tracing a solitary path down her cheek. She clenched her hand, the silk cool against her skin. It wasn't just kindness she saw in Elias. It was a strength she envied, a resilience born from a life she could barely comprehend. He hadn't the luxury of her sterile rehabilitation center. His recovery was taking place in a world she only knew through news reports and whispered anxieties. The thought of his struggles, his battles, both internal and external, intensified her guilt. A soft knock on the door broke through her contemplation. Anya's nurse entered, a kind woman with warm eyes and a gentle smile. "Your mother has left, Miss Anya. She mentioned wanting you to rest." Anya nodded, a silent relief washing over her. The silence, once oppressive, now felt like a balm. She was alone with her thoughts. The weight of her mother's disapproval eased, replaced by the quiet strength of her own burgeoning feelings. The storm had raged, leaving chaos and destruction in its wake. But it had also birthed something unexpected, something precious. And that, Anya knew, was worth fighting for. The battle for her heart, and for her future, had only just begun. The fluorescent lights of the public rehabilitation center hummed a monotonous tune, a stark contrast to the rhythmic thud of Elias's heart against his ribs. He sat on the worn edge of his cot, the thin mattress offering little comfort. The air hung heavy with the smell of antiseptic and stale sweat, a familiar scent that clung to him like a second skin. He traced the faded scar on his forearm, a souvenir from a past he desperately tried to bury. The memory of the storm, of Anya's terrified eyes, flickered in his mind, a painful yet strangely comforting warmth amidst the chill of his reality. A gruff voice broke through his reverie. "Heard you saved some rich girl from the flood," a man named Marco said, his voice laced with a mixture of awe and resentment. Marco, a burly man with eyes that held the weariness of countless battles, sat across from him, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. Elias shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "Just happened to be there," he mumbled, his voice rough. "Just happened," Marco echoed, a sardonic chuckle escaping his lips. "Yeah, right. Heard her family's throwing a fortune at finding whoever rescued her." The words stung. The thought of Anya's world, a world of privilege and comfort, felt a million miles away from his own harsh reality. He clenched his jaw, the anger a familiar, bitter taste in his mouth. "It's none of my business," he said, his tone sharp. Marco nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I get it. Different worlds," he said softly, his voice losing its edge. "But that's not a bad thing. Maybe it's a lifeline," he added, a flicker of hope in his usually cynical eyes. He gestured to his coffee. "Want some?" Elias hesitated, then nodded slowly. The simple act of accepting the coffee felt like a small crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. Maybe, just maybe, Marco was right. Maybe this wasn't just a storm-tossed rescue. Maybe it was the start of something more. The hum of the fluorescent lights no longer felt so monotonous. A different kind of warmth spread through him, a tentative hope blooming in the barren landscape of his soul. The sterile scent of disinfectant battled with the faint aroma of lilies Anya's mother insisted on, a jarring contrast in the stark, white room. Anya traced the intricate pattern of her silk duvet, the luxurious fabric a stark reminder of the chasm separating her world from Elias. The physical therapy was brutal, each movement a painful reminder of the storm's fury. But the dull ache in her leg was nothing compared to the gnawing emptiness inside. She missed Elias, the raw honesty in his eyes, the way his calloused hand had felt in hers amidst the chaos. A tear escaped, tracing a lonely path down her cheek. "He's not someone you should associate with, Anya." Her mother's voice cut through her thoughts, crisp and controlled, yet laced with an undercurrent of barely concealed disdain. Anya flinched. The words were a familiar refrain. "Mother, he saved my life," Anya retorted, her voice trembling slightly. The words tasted like defiance, like a tiny act of rebellion against the carefully constructed walls of her privileged existence. Her mother's expression hardened. "He's a product of his environment, Anya. Different worlds don't mix." The unspoken words hung heavy in the air. "He's not good enough." The image of Elias, his face etched with weariness and quiet strength, flashed in Anya's mind. She closed her eyes, clinging to the memory of his warmth, a stark contrast to the icy disapproval radiating from her mother. The pain in her leg pulsed, mirroring the ache in her heart. She wouldn't let them take him away. Not this time. Not ever. The luxury of her surroundings felt suffocating. A gilded cage trapping her in a world that felt increasingly alien and cold. The fluorescent lights of the public rehabilitation center hummed a monotonous tune, a stark contrast to the gentle murmur of the rain outside. Elias sat on the edge of his cot, the thin mattress offering little comfort. He stared at his calloused hands, gnarled and scarred, a testament to a life lived on the streets. The memory of Anya's delicate fingers intertwined with his during the storm flickered in his mind, a jarring juxtaposition to his current reality. He ran a hand through his short, dark hair, the rough texture a familiar comfort. A wave of nausea washed over him, the lingering effects of his withdrawal. He clenched his jaw, fighting back the urge to succumb to the familiar comfort of oblivion. He wouldn't. Not anymore. Not for her. The physiotherapist, a kind woman with tired eyes, entered, her presence a small beacon of hope in the otherwise bleak landscape. "How are you feeling, Elias?" she asked gently, her voice soft yet firm. "Like a broken-down machine," he mumbled, his voice raspy. He winced as he attempted a simple range-of-motion exercise, the pain a searing reminder of the injuries he'd sustained. "Progress takes time," she reassured him, her touch gentle as she guided his movements. "But you're making good progress. Your strength is improving." Her words were a balm to his wounded spirit, a small crack in the wall of cynicism he'd built around his heart. Later, alone again, he pulled out a crumpled photograph from his pocket, a picture of Anya, taken surreptitiously the day he'd rescued her. Her face, usually radiant, was etched with shock and fear, but a hint of gratitude flickered in her eyes. He traced the outline of her face, his thumb lingering on the delicate curve of her cheek. This image became his anchor, a lifeline connecting him to a world he never thought he'd be a part of. He closed his eyes, her image burned into his mind, a stark contrast to the grim reality of his surroundings. He thought of her luxurious rehabilitation center, a world away, and wondered if she thought of him too, if the chasm of their different worlds truly held them apart. The storm had brought them together. He wouldn't let anything, or anyone, tear them apart. The thought ignited a small, flickering flame of hope within his weary soul. The stale air of the rehab center hung heavy with the scent of antiseptic and despair. Elias, his body screaming in protest with each movement, stared at the chipped paint on the wall, the dull gray mirroring the bleakness in his soul. The memory of Anya's laughter, a bright, fleeting sunbeam in the storm-ravaged landscape of his life, felt like a distant dream. He clenched his fist, the rough fabric of his worn-out sweatpants a familiar comfort. A gruff voice broke through his reverie. "You all right, kid?" It was Marco, a fellow patient, his face a roadmap of past battles. Elias shrugged, the gesture sending a jolt of pain through his shoulder. "Just thinking," Marco snorted. "Thinking about the rich girl? The one you saved?" The question struck a nerve. Elias flinched, a surge of bitterness flooding him. "It's not like that," he muttered, avoiding Marco's gaze. The gulf between their worlds felt as vast as the ocean. He couldn't imagine what she thought of him now. "Don't kid yourself," Marco said, leaning closer. "She's a different world. Forget about her." His voice held a weary understanding. He'd been through his own share of heartbreak. Elias didn't reply, the silence thick with unspoken emotions. He knew Marco was right, logically, but a stubborn ember of hope refused to die. Anya was the first person in a long time to see past the hardened exterior he'd built to protect himself. To see the scared, broken boy beneath. The thought warmed him despite the icy chill of the room, a faint counterpoint to the sharp sting of his physical pain. That evening, during group therapy, a flicker of that same hope threatened to be extinguished. A carelessly spoken comment about his luck in rescuing a wealthy heiress, fueled by envy and resentment, triggered a wave of anger. He found himself snapping, his voice tight with a raw emotion he struggled to contain. The therapist, a woman with kind eyes that saw past the bravado, guided him gently through his anger. He realized he was projecting his own self-loathing onto Anya's privilege. He was angry at the injustice of his circumstances, angry at the hand life had dealt him, but he was taking it out on her. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He looked down at his hands, ashamed. He was just as trapped by his prejudices as Anya might be by hers. The storm hadn't just changed their lives. It had given him a chance at something better, something real. He wouldn't let his past, or his bitterness, destroy that chance. He wouldn't let it destroy her. The sterile scent of disinfectant couldn't mask the faint sweetness of Anya's perfume, a ghost clinging to the worn fabric of the chair where she'd sat during their last clandestine meeting. Elias traced the faint indentation left by her body, a phantom touch that sent a shiver down his spine. He hadn't slept properly since their last visit, haunted by the fear of discovery, the chasm of their different worlds a constant threat. He longed to feel the warmth of her hand in his, to hear the soft timbre of her voice, a soothing balm against the raw edges of his soul. A low whistle broke the silence. Marco, leaning against the doorway, watched him with a knowing smirk. "Still mooning over the heiress, huh?" Elias flinched, pulling his knees to his chest. "It's not like that," he mumbled, his voice rough with unshed tears. He felt the familiar burn of shame, the sting of his own inadequacy. He wasn't worthy of her. "Don't kid yourself," Marco said softly, his gruff exterior softening slightly. "You're a good man, Elias, but good ain't enough sometimes." He paused, studying Elias's downcast face. "She's got a whole different life, a world you wouldn't even know how to navigate. You're both hurting. It's better this way." Elias's eyes welled up. "But she's the only one who ever saw me," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. He felt a deep ache in his chest, a raw wound laid bare. She saw past all the crap. Marco sat beside him, the weight of shared experience settling between them like a shared burden. "Maybe," he conceded, "but she can't fix you, and you can't fix her. You both need to heal on your own first. He patted Elias's shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken understanding. Elias knew Marco was right, his logic clear and sharp. Yet, hope, a fragile butterfly, fluttered within his chest. He couldn't erase the memory of Anya's hand in his, the warmth of her eyes, the shared vulnerability that transcended their different worlds. He had to find a way to bridge the impossible gap, to make this fragile hope something more enduring, something real. The following weeks were a blur of stolen moments. Anya, her arm still in a sling, would slip away from her guarded rehabilitation center, her breath catching in her throat each time she risked it. Elias, his own injuries slowly mending, would meet her in a secluded corner of the sprawling city park. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves a stark contrast to the sterile smells of their respective recovery wards. Their conversations were hushed, urgent, a desperate need to connect amidst the looming threat of discovery. "I dreamt of the storm again last night," Anya whispered one evening, her voice barely audible above the rustling leaves. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, mirroring the turmoil within her. It felt so real. The wind, the rain. Elias, his gaze fixed on her face, reached out, his fingers brushing against her pale cheek. "I dreamt of you," he admitted, his voice raw. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, a fleeting moment of vulnerability he treasured. The touch sent a shiver down her spine, a mixture of fear and longing. "My family, they don't understand," she confided, her voice laced with despair. "They want me to forget, to move on." Elias nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. He knew what it felt like to be dismissed, to be seen as damaged goods. "But you won't," he said, his voice filled with unwavering conviction. His heart ached with empathy for her. "I don't want to," she replied, her eyes locking with his. A fragile hope flickered in their shared gaze, a spark of defiance against the odds stacked against them. The sound of approaching footsteps shattered the fragile intimacy. Anya gasped, her eyes wide with panic. Elias instinctively pulled her closer, shielding her from view. The fear in her eyes mirrored his own. Their stolen moments were increasingly perilous, their connection a fragile flame flickering in the wind of societal disapproval. The risk was rising exponentially. He knew their clandestine meetings couldn't last forever, the weight of their different worlds pressing down upon them, threatening to extinguish their fragile hope. But for now, in the heart of the city park, amidst the fading light, they found solace in each other's arms, clinging to the warmth of a connection that transcended their worlds. The hushed intensity of their meetings became a ritual. Anya, cloaked in a large borrowed scarf, would meet Elias near the old, crumbling fountain in the park, the chipped stone cold beneath her gloved hands. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves still held a strange comfort, a shared secret. "They're watching," Anya whispered one evening, her voice trembling. The city lights blurred through the falling snow, casting long, distorted shadows. Elias's hand found hers, his calloused fingers a stark contrast to her soft skin. "I know," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "But they can't take this away." He squeezed her hand, the simple gesture radiating a strength that calmed her. He spoke of his childhood, the harsh realities of poverty and neglect, painted with raw honesty. Anya listened, her initial pity morphing into something deeper: empathy, respect, a dawning understanding of the resilience hidden beneath his cynicism. His words painted a world so far removed from her own, yet the shared vulnerability in their gazes bridged the chasm. She, in turn, revealed the stifling constraints of her wealth, the hollow ache beneath the gilded cage of her life. She confessed her fear of disappointing her family, of being seen as weak or flawed. The snow fell faster now, a silent witness to their shared confidences. The chill in the air felt insignificant compared to the warmth growing between them, a fragile hope blooming amidst the winter's bleakness. Their clandestine meetings continued, each stolen moment a precious defiance, their love a whispered secret against the roar of disapproval. The risk was undeniable, But the joy, the shared understanding, made it worthwhile. The city's noise faded, the only sound their hushed whispers and the gentle fall of snow. The biting wind whipped Anya's hair across her face as she hurried towards the fountain, the borrowed scarf barely containing the chill. She spotted Elias already there, his silhouette stark against the twilight. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves still clung to the air, a familiar comfort. He looked up, a flicker of something akin to hope in his eyes. "There, more vigilant," Anya whispered, her breath misting in the cold. Fear edged her voice. Elias's hand covered hers, his calloused fingers strangely comforting against her soft skin. "Let them watch," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "This isn't something they can control." The city lights painted the park in streaks of amber and gold, highlighting the chipped stone of the fountain. Anya, despite her fear, felt a surge of defiance, a thrill in the forbidden nature of their meetings. She shifted closer, the warmth of his body radiating against hers. "My family, they're planning an intervention," she confessed, her voice barely a breath. The words hung heavy in the frigid air, laden with unspoken anxieties. Elias's gaze softened. He saw the vulnerability beneath Anya's carefully constructed facade, the fear that mirrored his own past battles. He squeezed her hand, offering silent reassurance. "They don't understand," he said gently. "But we do." A sudden gust of wind scattered fallen leaves, swirling them around their feet like miniature whirlwinds. The city's noise seemed to fade, replaced by the rhythmic beat of their hearts. In the shared silence, a deeper understanding blossomed, a bond forged in defiance and shared vulnerability. The cold, the risk, the fear, none of it mattered as much as the warmth of their connection, a fragile flame burning brightly against the encroaching darkness. The city's indifference was forgotten. Only their shared secret remained. Their love, a whispered defiance, a fragile hope amidst the winter's harsh reality. The mahogany door of Anya's family estate creaked shut behind her, the sound echoing the turmoil in her heart. Inside, the hushed opulence felt like a gilded cage. Her reflection in a polished silver frame showed a haunted fragility she hadn't noticed before. The crisp scent of lilies, usually comforting, now felt suffocating. She sank onto a velvet chaise lounge, the plush fabric offering little solace. Her mother's words, "This is unacceptable, Anya. He's not suitable, echoed cruelly. A sharp rap on her door startled her. It was her grandmother, her eyes filled with a surprising compassion. "Anya, my dear," her grandmother began, her voice soft but firm. "Your mother is blinded by tradition, but I see something in Elias's eyes. A strength, a resilience. Something your grandfather had." Anya's breath hitched. Her grandfather, a man she barely remembered, but whose spirit lived on in old photographs, a kind smile contrasting sharply with the coldness of her present reality. "But Grandma, they'll never accept him. His past, my present?" "Your present," her grandmother countered, taking her hand, "is defined by your choices, Anya, not by their expectations. This boy, this Elias, he rescued you. He saved you from the storm, and perhaps," she paused, her gaze intense, "he's here to save you from something even worse." The weight of her words settled heavily upon Anya. The old woman's subtle endorsement felt like a lifeline in the choppy sea of her family's disapproval. Anya considered this, remembering Elias's calloused hands, the strength in his usually silent presence, the vulnerability that only she seemed to glimpse. The chasm between their worlds felt immense, yet she felt a connection with him, stronger than anything she had ever known. That night, a single white rose, left anonymously on her bedside table, spoke volumes more than any words. It was Elias's quiet rebellion, a whispered defiance in the face of their insurmountable differences. The fragrance, sharp and sweet, filled her room and eased her anxieties. The storm outside had subsided, but the tempest within her raged on. The battle for her future had just begun. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Elias as he watched Anya from across the sprawling hospital grounds. She sat on a sun-drenched bench, her elegant clothes a stark contrast to the worn-out tracksuit he wore. He'd snuck out, defying the rehab center's strict rules, drawn by an irresistible force. The sight of her, frail but resolute, tugged at something deep within him. He knew he shouldn't be here. He knew her world was light years away from his own. "Anya," he called out, his voice rough, hesitant. She looked up, her eyes widening slightly in surprise. A faint smile touched her lips, a flicker of recognition amidst the apprehension. "Elias," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle rustle of leaves. He approached slowly, the gravel crunching under his worn sneakers. The distance between them felt vast, a chasm etched by privilege and poverty, trauma and sheltered upbringing. Yet, in their shared gaze, a silent understanding lingered. A bridge formed amidst the storm's wreckage. I saw you were here," he mumbled, shoving his hands deep into his pockets. He felt awkward, clumsy in her presence. The manicured lawns and the elegant architecture of the hospital felt alien, a world he'd only glimpsed during the storm. Anya rose, her movements still tentative. "My family, they're trying to keep us apart," she confessed, her voice laced with a mixture of sadness and defiance. "They say it's for the best." He nodded, understanding dawning on him. He'd anticipated this. Her family, the world she represented, wouldn't understand their unlikely connection. He knew all too well the prejudice that separated people, the invisible walls that kept the haves and have-nots worlds apart. "They don't understand," he said simply, the words heavy with unspoken truths. He looked away, his gaze settling on the distant cityscape, the glittering skyscrapers mirroring the vastness of the gulf separating their lives. "But I do." Anya reached out, her hand gently touching his arm. The contact sent a jolt through him, a raw electric current that defied their disparate worlds. In that touch, in that fleeting moment, he saw not just the heiress, but a woman wounded, vulnerable, and brave enough to defy her family. Their shared ordeal during the storm, it seemed, had carved a bond deeper than any social divide. The tension in the air was palpable, a charged silence that spoke volumes louder than words could ever express. The unspoken promise hung between them, a fragile hope amidst the looming reality of their different worlds. He knew the fight for their connection had just begun. The crisp autumn air bit at Elias's cheeks as he watched Anya from across the manicured lawn. Sunlight glinted off the polished windows of her rehabilitation center, a stark contrast to the gritty brick of his own. He'd risked another clandestine visit, the thrill of defiance a fleeting high against the gnawing anxiety. He saw her through the glass, her pale face illuminated by the warm glow of an interior lamp, a book clutched in her hands. He imagined her fingers tracing the elegant script, a world away from the rough edges of his own life. A wave of self-doubt washed over him. What was he doing? Her world was one of privilege and ease. His, a constant battle for survival. He was a ghost haunting her gilded cage. But the pull towards her was stronger than any self-preservation instinct. He shifted his weight, the worn fabric of his jeans a comforting contrast to the imagined softness of her cashmere sweaters. He'd seen the way her family looked at him, disdain, suspicion, a silent judgment that cut deeper than any knife. He understood their fear. He would have reacted the same way if the roles were reversed. Suddenly, Anya looked up, her gaze sweeping across the lawn. Their eyes met, and a jolt of electricity crackled between them, a silent acknowledgement of their forbidden connection. She rose, a hesitant grace in her movements, and approached the window. He could see the faintest blush bloom on her cheeks. "Elias," she whispered, her voice barely audible, even through the thick glass. The word felt like a fragile butterfly, risking its wings on the wind. "Anya," he breathed back, his voice raspy. The distance felt monumental, a chasm separating not just their worlds but also their fears. He yearned to reach her, to cross the invisible line that separated them, but the knowledge of the insurmountable obstacles held him back. The weight of unspoken words, unspoken realities, pressed down on him, heavy and inescapable. He wondered if this illicit connection would prove more destructive than constructive. The fear was tangible, a cold dread that coiled around his heart. But he knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that he couldn't let her go. The following week brought a flurry of hushed conversations and furtive glances. Anya's family, led by her imperious mother, launched a subtle but relentless campaign to sever the connection between her and Elias. Subtle threats veiled as concern peppered Anya's therapy sessions. The scent of lilies, Anya's mother's favorite, seemed to cling to the air around Anya, a suffocating perfume that mirrored the suffocating pressure. One evening, under the cloak of twilight, Elias found Anya sitting by the reflecting pool in the rehab center's manicured gardens. The air hummed with the low thrum of crickets, a counterpoint to the quiet turmoil in her heart. She clutched a small, smooth stone, turning it over and over in her hands, its cool surface a stark contrast to the burning intensity in her eyes. "They're trying to keep us apart?" Anya whispered, her voice barely audible above the water's gentle lapping. The scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine filled the air. Elias sat beside her, the rough texture of the stone bench a familiar comfort. He reached for her hand, his touch tentative, respectful. Her skin felt fragile beneath his. "I know," he said, his voice low and husky, "but it won't work." Anya looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "They say I'm foolish, that you're bad for me, that you're using me." Tears welled in her eyes, threatening to spill over. The stone felt slippery in her hand. "They don't know you," Elias said firmly, his gaze unwavering. He squeezed her hand gently. "And they don't know me." He felt the tremor in her hand, a vulnerability that mirrored his own. The unspoken fear hung heavy between them, a tangible thing, like the humid night air. He knew her family's fear stemmed from a place of privilege and protection, but it also felt like a cage, and he ached to break it for her. "This isn't just some fleeting infatuation, Anya. It's more than that." Anya looked away, her gaze fixed on the shimmering water. The distant city lights flickered, mirroring the uncertainty in her heart. The silence stretched, filled only with the sounds of nature and the quiet thrum of unspoken emotions. The weight of their worlds, so vastly different, pressed down on them. Yet, in that shared space, beneath the watchful eyes of the night, their bond felt unbreakable. The future remained uncertain, but in that moment, their connection was a beacon of hope against the encroaching darkness. The scent of antiseptic and lilies, a jarring combination, clung to the air in Anya's therapy room. Dr. Albright's gentle probing felt like an intrusion, a dissection of feelings Anya preferred to keep buried. She recounted her secret meetings with Elias, the stolen moments by the reflecting pool, the raw honesty in their shared silences. Her voice, usually so poised, trembled slightly. The doctor's carefully neutral expression gave nothing away. Later, walking the manicured paths of the rehabilitation center, the weight of her family's disapproval pressed down on Anya. The meticulously pruned hedges seemed to mock her internal turmoil, their perfect symmetry a stark contrast to the chaos within. The sun, setting in a blaze of orange and purple, cast long shadows, stretching and distorting the familiar landscape. A crumpled note slipped under her door that evening shattered the fragile calm. Elias's handwriting, bold and uneven, filled the page. "Meet me by the old oak. Tonight. It's important." The oak tree, ancient and gnarled, stood sentinel at the edge of the grounds. Its branches, like skeletal arms, clawed at the twilight sky. Anya found Elias waiting, his silhouette a dark smudge against the moonlit lawn. He didn't speak, just pulled her into a hug, the warmth of his body a stark contrast to the chill evening air. She buried her face in his shoulder, the scent of wood smoke and rain on earth grounding her. "They're escalating things," he whispered, his voice rough with concern. "My probation officer. They're threatening to revoke it." He pulled back, his eyes filled with a fierce determination that both frightened and comforted her. "Because of me?" Anya's voice was barely a breath. "Partly," he admitted. "But they've been looking for a reason since the storm. This This just gives them an excuse. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying his underlying anxiety. The fear in his eyes was palpable. It was a fear she recognized, a fear that mirrored her own. Anya looked around, the vastness of the night sky mirroring the immensity of her fear. The potential loss of Elias felt like a physical blow. But in that moment, cradled in his arms, she felt a surge of defiance. The carefully constructed walls of her privileged world were crumbling, revealing a raw, powerful emotion beneath. Love that defied logic, family, and social barriers. This love, fierce and undeniable, was a force neither could ignore. The oak tree creaked above them, a silent witness to their defiant love. The night was filled with the hum of insects and the distant sounds of the city, a backdrop to their silent vow of resilience against the oncoming storm. The sterile scent of the rehabilitation center couldn't mask the earthy fragrance of the wood smoke clinging to Elias's clothes. Anya, watching him from across the sparsely furnished room, felt a pang of guilt. His probation officer's threat hung heavy between them, an unspoken weight pressing down on their fragile connection. Sunlight, filtered through the tall windows, illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, mirroring the uncertainty swirling in Anya's heart. "They're serious," Elias said, his voice low, a tremor betraying his carefully constructed composure. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the gesture revealing his inner turmoil. The casual setting couldn't disguise the gravity of the situation. Anya swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "I know," she whispered, her gaze dropping to her hands, nervously twisting her fingers. The manicured perfection of her nails felt jarringly out of place in this raw moment. The fear she had felt under the oak tree returned, a cold knot in her stomach. He moved closer, the floorboards creaking softly beneath his weight. He didn't touch her, but his presence filled the space, a comforting warmth amidst the chilling threat. I don't want to lose you," he admitted, his eyes locking with hers, conveying a depth of emotion that transcended words. The vulnerability in his gaze was a stark contrast to his usual guarded demeanor. Anya's carefully constructed composure crumbled. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the already fading sunlight. "Me neither," she choked out, her voice thick with emotion. The fear of losing him, of losing this unexpected, fiercely defiant love, was overwhelming. She reached out, her fingers brushing his, a silent acknowledgement of their shared vulnerability, their shared fear. The silence that followed was filled with unspoken emotions. Fear, determination, love. It was a silence far more potent than any words could have been. The threat loomed, but in that shared moment of vulnerability, a quiet strength bloomed between them, a strength born of shared adversity and a love that refused to be silenced. The potential loss loomed, a stark reminder of the fragility of their newfound happiness. Yet their connection, forged in the heart of a storm, remained unshaken, a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. The rehabilitation center's sterile scent clashed with the lingering scent of wood smoke on Elias's clothes, a stark reminder of their different worlds. Anya traced the rim of her teacup, the delicate porcelain a fragile contrast to the storm that had brought them together. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a silent metaphor for the uncertainty swirling in their hearts. "My family, they're making it difficult," Anya confessed, her voice barely a whisper. Her usually vibrant eyes were shadowed with worry. The carefully constructed composure she usually presented had crumbled, revealing a vulnerability that both frightened and captivated Elias. He leaned forward, his gaze intense, yet gentle. "They don't understand," he said, his voice low and understanding. He knew the sting of judgment, the weight of expectations. He understood the suffocating pressure of a life lived under scrutiny. Anya nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "They see you as unsuitable." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications of class and background, of prejudice and fear. The image of her father's cold disapproval flashed in her mind. The image stung her. Elias reached across the small table, his fingers gently brushing hers. The The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, a spark that momentarily eclipsed the fear. "Let them see what they're missing," he murmured, his voice husky with emotion. His touch was a silent promise, a defiance against the disapproval that loomed over them. The silence stretched, a comfortable quiet punctuated by the soft clinking of their teacups. In that shared silence, a deeper understanding bloomed. Anya felt a shift within herself, a newfound strength, a determination to fight for their connection. She squeezed his hand, a silent affirmation, a silent vow. The thread of separation hung over them, heavy and oppressive, yet their shared strength, forged in the crucible of adversity, shone brighter than ever before. The storm had passed, but its impact, profound and lasting, continued to shape their lives, their connection, their future. The path ahead remained uncertain, fraught with challenges. But in this shared moment of quiet understanding, they found the courage to face whatever lay ahead, together. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Anya's rehabilitation center. Inside, a quiet intensity hung in the air. Anya, her hands still faintly trembling, reread Elias's letter. The scent of lilies, always present in the center, felt suffocating today. His words, penned in a scrawled hand that belied the strength of his spirit, painted vivid pictures of his life before the storm, a life far removed from her own sheltered existence. She saw the gritty streets, felt the cold dampness of the alleyways he described, smelled the acrid tang of smoke from his childhood home. The imagery shocked her, yet strangely comforted her. It explained the hardened exterior, the guarded cynicism, the raw, untamed power she had glimpsed beneath it all. A tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail through the carefully applied makeup. She was learning about resilience, learning it not from textbooks or lectures, but from the raw, unfiltered life of a young man who had survived against all odds. He was not just a rescuer. He was a testament to the enduring human spirit. A knock on the door startled her. It was her therapist, Dr. Albright, a kind woman with knowing eyes. "Anya, dear," she began gently, "I've reviewed your progress report. The sessions have been illuminating, haven't they?" Anya managed a weak smile. I'm learning things about myself, things I never knew existed. And about the world beyond your own, perhaps?" Dr. Albright asked softly, her gaze lingering on the letter clutched in Anya's hand. The unspoken question hung in the air about Elias. Anya nodded, tears welling up again. He's shown me a different perspective, a perspective I desperately needed. And that's good, Anya, very good. But remember, Dr. Albright continued, her voice warming with empathy, healing involves confronting the realities of your own life as well as understanding others. Your family's concerns, they stem from a place of love, even if it's misguided. Their fear is real, but it shouldn't overshadow your own heart. The words struck a chord. Dr. Albright's wisdom, her gentle guidance, provided a much-needed anchor in the storm of conflicting emotions that raged within her. She understood now. The conflict wasn't just about Elias, but about her own journey to self-discovery, her willingness to defy expectations and embrace a love that defied all social boundaries. The decision ahead was hers alone. But for the first time, she felt a strength bloom within her, stronger than the fear. She would choose her heart. She would choose Elias. The biting November wind whipped through the gaps in the rehab center's aging windows, carrying with it the scent of damp leaves and distant city sirens. Elias sat on the cracked vinyl of a waiting room chair, the worn fabric a familiar comfort in its own way. He watched Anya from across the room. She was a fragile porcelain doll in a sea of worn-out lives, her laughter a jarring melody against the background hum of whispered anxieties and controlled coughs. He'd found her here, tucked away in this opulent facility, a world away from the stark reality of his own recovery. The sheer difference was a constant, gnawing reminder of the chasm that separated them. He watched her interact with her mother, the careful touch, the forced smiles betraying a simmering tension. Anya's elegance felt almost suffocating in this environment, a stark contrast to the worn-out clothes and weary faces surrounding her. Her mother, draped in expensive cashmere, spoke in hushed, worried tones. The words were inaudible, but the expression on Anya's face, a mixture of weariness and defiance, spoke volumes. Later, alone, Anya found him in the dimly lit common room. "They don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the muted television. Her eyes, usually sparkling with an untamed spirit, held a deep well of sadness. Elias shifted uncomfortably. "Understand what? That it wasn't just a rescue. That it's more." She traced a pattern on the worn tabletop, her fingers lingering on a chipped piece of veneer, a tiny mirror of the cracks in her meticulously crafted world. The weight of her unspoken words hung heavy in the air. He looked at her, seeing the vulnerability etched beneath her carefully maintained composure. The storm had ripped away the facade of her privileged life, leaving her raw and exposed, much like himself. A shared vulnerability, forged in the heart of a raging tempest. The storm that had brought them together was also slowly eroding the walls they had both built around their hearts. "They're scared," he finally said, his voice rough but gentle. "Scared of what they don't understand." He reached across the small space separating them, his hand hovering above hers before retracting. He didn't want to scare her. Anya nodded, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "And I'm scared too. Of losing you, of losing myself, of disappointing them." The unspoken question hung between them, thick with the unspoken promises and dangers inherent in their burgeoning love. The storm outside had subsided, but the turmoil within continued to rage, threatening to tear them apart or, perhaps, forge a bond that would withstand any tempest. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air of Anya's private room, a stark contrast to the earthy smell of rain that still clung to Elias's clothes. He sat awkwardly on a plush armchair, its silk upholstery a world away from the worn vinyl of his rehab center. Anya, pale but recovering, lay propped against pillows, her hand tracing the delicate pattern on her silk duvet. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. They want me to go back," Anya finally said, her voice thin and hesitant. The words hung in the air, fragile as spun glass. Elias watched her, his heart clenching. He knew what that meant, a return to a life of gilded cages and suffocating expectations. A life that felt as alien to him as the moon. He shifted, the plush cushions uncomfortable beneath him. "They don't understand," he replied, his voice gruff but gentle. "They don't see what we have." Anya looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, creating a poignant, ethereal scene. "It's different," she whispered, her gaze dropping to her hands. It's not how it's supposed to be." He reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against hers. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through him, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken bond between them. The touch was brief, but it spoke volumes. "It's how it should be," Elias countered softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Forget supposed to. Forget what they expect. What matters is us." Anya's eyes met his, a flicker of hope igniting within their depths. For a moment, the world outside, the disapproving glances, the societal pressures, faded away. Only their shared vulnerability and undeniable connection remained, a beacon of hope amidst the storm of their disparate lives. The beep of the heart monitor seemed to echo their shared rhythm, a steady pulse of defiance against the odds. The storm outside had passed, but the tempest within their hearts had only just begun to truly rage, a storm of a different kind, one that promised not destruction, but the potential for a love that defied all boundaries. The following days were a blur of stolen moments. Anya, defying her family's watchful eyes, would slip away to the quiet corner of the rehab center's sprawling gardens. The scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine mingled with the faint antiseptic still clinging to her. Elias would find her there, perched on a weathered stone bench, the afternoon sun warming her pale skin. He'd bring her a paperback, its pages dog-eared and worn, a stark contrast to the pristine books that lined her family's library. "This one's about a runaway kid," Elias said one afternoon, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. He watched her, his calloused fingers tracing the spine. He saw a flicker of something, understanding, empathy, in her usually guarded eyes. Anya smiled, a hesitant, fragile thing. "Runaway kids. I can't imagine." "Neither could I," Elias admitted, his gaze distant. "But some cages are harder to escape than others." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. He saw her shiver, a response not just to the chill of the late afternoon breeze, but to the raw emotion in his voice. That evening, back in his cramped rehab room, the faint scent of jasmine lingered on his clothes, a ghost of Anya's presence. He stared at a faded photograph of his younger self, a carefree grin plastered on his face. The sharp contrast between that boy and the man staring back at him from the mirror was a bitter pill to swallow. He'd thought he'd escaped his past, but Anya's presence had cracked open the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his heart, revealing a chasm of vulnerability he hadn't known existed. He felt exposed, raw, yet oddly alive. Their clandestine meetings continued, each encounter a fragile rebellion against the world that sought to keep them apart. They spoke of dreams, hers of helping others, his of simply finding peace. They shared laughter, tears, and a growing understanding that transcended the chasm of their disparate worlds. The storm of their lives had passed, yet the aftershocks, the lingering anxieties, the unspoken fears were still reverberating, shaping their hearts in ways neither could have predicted. The future remained uncertain, but in their shared vulnerability, they found a strength neither possessed alone, a quiet, unwavering defiance against a world that told them they shouldn't belong together. The crisp autumn air bit at Elias's cheeks as he watched Anya from across the rehab center's courtyard. Sunlight glinted off the gold chain at her throat, a stark contrast to the worn denim jacket he wore. He saw the way she flinched when a loud car backfired, a tremor of lingering fear in her usually composed posture. He knew that fear. It was a constant companion. He found her later, sketching in a worn leather-bound journal, the faint scent of lavender clinging to the pages. He sat beside her, the silence comfortable, punctuated only by the rustle of turning leaves. "It's beautiful," he murmured, nodding towards her sketch, a vibrant rendering of the storm-ravaged coastline. Anya looked up, a surprised smile touching her lips. You like it?" "It's raw," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Like the storm itself." He saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes, a shared recognition of the turmoil reflected in the swirling lines of charcoal. "I'm still haunted by it," Anya whispered, her voice barely audible. The sound, the feeling of being completely out of control. Elias nodded, understanding etched deep into his face. He reached into his pocket, offering her a smooth, gray river stone. "I found this after the rescue. Felt grounding." She took it, turning it over in her hands, her fingers tracing its cool surface. "It's beautiful," she echoed, her voice catching slightly. A tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. Elias reached out, gently brushing it away with his thumb. The touch was brief, yet incredibly intimate, a silent acknowledgement of shared vulnerability. In that fleeting moment, the chasm between their worlds seemed to narrow, a fragile bridge built on empathy and shared trauma. The golden chain at her throat seemed less significant than the quiet strength in her gaze. For the first time, Elias saw beyond her wealth, her privilege, to the resilient spirit battling its own storm within. He saw himself reflected in her eyes. The bitter taste of cynicism began to dissolve on his tongue, replaced by the fragile sweetness of hope. The scent of antiseptic and lavender hung heavy in the air of Anya's private room. Rain lashed against the window panes, a rhythmic counterpoint to the soft, uneven rhythm of Anya's breathing. Elias sat beside her bed, the worn river stone still nestled in his palm, a tangible link to the night their worlds collided. He watched her sleep, her face pale but peaceful, the storm outside mirroring the one she'd weathered within. He'd come early, defying the unspoken rules, the invisible wall that separated their realities. Anya stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. She saw him immediately, a soft smile gracing her lips. "You came," she whispered, her voice raspy. "Couldn't stay away," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. Than usual. He watched her approach, the grace in her movements a subtle reminder of the chasm that still separated them. He shifted uncomfortably in the luxurious chair, feeling profoundly out of place. Anya poured 2 cups of tea, the delicate clinking of china a sharp contrast to the silence that had fallen between them. She handed him a cup, the warmth seeping into his chilled fingers. He took a sip, the subtle sweetness a welcome balm to his frayed nerves. "My family, they're talking about sending me to another facility," Anya said, her voice barely a whisper. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken fear. He could see the tremor in her hand as she held the cup. Elias felt a cold dread grip his chest. The fight wasn't over. He knew their bond had grown, stronger than either of them could have predicted. But this was a new battlefield, a battle for her very future. "They can't do that," he said, his voice stronger than he felt. He saw the silent plea in her eyes, a desperate need for reassurance. He set down the cup, his hand covering hers. "They won't," he insisted, his voice firmer, fueled by a growing determination. "We won't let them." He squeezed her hand, a silent promise of unwavering support, a pledge against the storm gathering on the horizon. The warmth of her hand, soft against his calloused one, gave him strength. He felt a surge of protective love, fierce and undeniable. This wasn't just about Anya anymore. It was about their shared fight, their interwoven fates, a testament to the resilience of a love born amidst a raging storm. Their intertwined fingers spoke volumes, a silent declaration of defiance against a world that wanted to keep them apart. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to the air, a stark contrast to the earthy aroma of the woods Elias remembered from their first encounter. He sat on a hard plastic chair, the uncomfortable rigidity mirroring the tension coiling in his gut. Anya's therapy session had just ended, and the muted sounds of the bustling rehabilitation center faded into a low hum. He watched her emerge, her face pale, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. The silk of her robe couldn't hide the tremor in her hands. "It was difficult," she whispered, her voice catching. She sank onto the chair beside him, the slight slump of her shoulders betraying her exhaustion. Elias reached out, his calloused hand gently covering hers. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through him, a silent affirmation of their bond, a stark contrast to the cold plastic of the chair. He felt the tremors beneath his touch. They said I'm not ready," she continued, her voice choked with unshed tears. "That my recovery isn't complete enough." The words were laced with self-doubt, a vulnerability that made Elias's chest ache. The afternoon sunlight, filtering through the large windows, cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air, a miniature storm reflecting the turmoil within them. He squeezed her hand, offering silent reassurance. "They don't know you," he said, his voice low and steady, a counterpoint to the storm brewing within Anya. "They don't see the strength you have, the fight you've already won." Anya looked up, her eyes searching his. For a moment, the only sound was the gentle hum of the fluorescent lights, a stark counterpoint to the silent conversation passing between them. He saw a flicker of hope ignite within the depths of her eyes, a fragile flame against the darkness of her fear. "But what if they're right?" she whispered, the question hanging heavy in the air. "What if I'm not strong enough?" Elias pulled her closer, his embrace a haven against the storm of uncertainty. He felt the warmth of her body against his, a palpable connection that transcended words. "You are," he said firmly, his voice filled with a conviction that surprised even him. "You're stronger than you think. Stronger than they know." He held her tight, the unspoken promise of unwavering support weaving itself into the fabric of their embrace. The fight was far from over, But in that shared moment of vulnerability and strength, they found a renewed resolve, a shared determination to weather the storm together. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished mahogany desk in Anya's family's sprawling estate. Dust motes, illuminated by the slanting light, swirled like miniature tornadoes. Anya sat stiffly, the plush velvet of the chair offering little comfort. Her grandmother, a formidable woman with eyes as sharp as flint, sat opposite, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The silence hummed with unspoken accusations. "Your mother is distraught, Anya," her grandmother finally said, her voice a low, controlled rumble. The words felt like tiny stones, each one chipping away at Anya's already fragile composure. Anya swallowed, the dryness in her throat mirroring the desert landscape of her emotions. "I know, Grandma, but she began, her voice trembling slightly. "But you what? You choose a delinquent over your family? Over your future?" Her grandmother's voice edged with disapproval, a sharp contrast to the floral scent clinging to the air in the sun-drenched room. Tears pricked at Anya's eyes. The scent of lilies, usually soothing, felt suffocating. "He's not a delinquent, Grandma. She searched for the right words, the weight of her grandmother's disapproval pressing down on her. "He's good, he's kind, and he helped me." Her grandmother's lips thinned. "Helping you doesn't negate his background, Anya. You're being reckless, foolish. This Elias, he's not good for you." The coldness in her grandmother's tone was a physical blow. Anya's breath hitched. The anger, simmering beneath the surface for weeks, finally boiled over. "How can you judge him without even knowing him? You haven't even met him." She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the polished floor, the sound jarring in the sudden silence. "He's from a different world, Anya. A world we don't understand, and one that doesn't understand us." Her grandmother's voice softened slightly, but the underlying message remained unchanged. "This isn't just about your feelings. It's about your future, your safety." The weight of her grandmother's words settled heavily on Anya. The image of Elias's calloused hands, his gentle touch, flashed in her mind. The stark contrast between their worlds, a chasm that seemed unbridgeable, loomed large. Yet, despite the fear, a defiant spark ignited within her. This wasn't just about her future or safety. It was about her heart. And her heart, she realized, belonged to Elias. The sterile scent of antiseptic battled the faint, floral perfume clinging to Anya's clothes. She sat across from Elias in the sparsely furnished waiting room of the rehabilitation center, the low hum of fluorescent lights a constant background drone. He looked thinner, the sharp angles of his face more pronounced, but his eyes, usually shadowed with cynicism, held a flicker of something akin to hope. "They're letting me out next week," he said, his voice rough but quieter than she remembered. Anya's heart leaped, then a wave of apprehension washed over her. Next week, so soon. The thought of him leaving, of the distance between their worlds widening again, threatened to suffocate her. The vibrant colors of the abstract painting on the wall seemed dull, lifeless, mirroring her own uncertain feelings. "That's good," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. The words felt inadequate, hollow, failing to capture the turmoil within her. He nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands, calloused and scarred, fidgeting nervously. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, laden with unspoken fears and anxieties. The faint scent of coffee from the vending machine did little to alleviate the tension. "My grandmother, she's still not happy," Anya confessed, her voice trembling slightly. The admission felt like a physical weight lifting from her chest, yet a profound sense of loneliness accompanied it. Elias met her gaze, his expression unreadable. The weight of her family's disapproval pressed down on them both. A single shaft of sunlight cut through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a fragile beauty contrasting sharply with the gravity of their situation. "She doesn't have to be," he finally said, his voice low and steady. "It's your life." The simple words were a lifeline, a reassurance that resonated deeply within her. Anya's breath hitched, his unwavering support, his quiet strength, felt more precious than anything her family could offer. She reached across the small space separating them, her fingers brushing against his. The contact was electric, a silent affirmation of their bond, a defiance against the world's attempts to pull them apart. In that shared touch, a silent promise was made, a commitment to fight for their connection, to navigate the turbulent waters of their different worlds. Together, the fluorescent hum faded into the background as they found solace in each other's presence, a beacon of hope in the dim waiting room. The crisp autumn air bit at Anya's exposed skin as she walked towards Elias's small, rented apartment. The scent of wood smoke and something faintly spicy cinnamon, perhaps, hung in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile perfume of her usual world. Hesitancy tugged at her, a familiar fear whispering of disapproval, of societal chasm. But the warmth in Elias's eyes, the unwavering strength she'd seen him display, outweighed it all. He opened the door before she could even knock, a small, hesitant smile playing on his lips. The apartment was small, furnished sparsely, but with a comforting, lived-in feel. Sunlight streamed through a grimy window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden light. Felt real in a way her opulent home never had. I baked something," Anya stammered, holding up a slightly lopsided apple pie. The warmth of the pie, radiating through the tin, mirrored the warmth blooming in her chest. Elias chuckled, a low rumble that sent shivers down her spine. "You didn't have to." His eyes, usually guarded, were soft, filled with a gratitude that both thrilled and humbled her. They sat at a small, worn kitchen table, the scent of the pie mingling with the lingering wood smoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, a shared understanding woven into the fabric of their connection. "My grandmother," she softened a bit, Anya confessed, picking at a loose thread on her cardigan. The admission felt like a fragile victory. Elias nodded, his gaze fixed on the steaming mug in his hands. "That's good," he said quietly, the words laced with a cautious optimism. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly, a visible sign of his relief. The conversation drifted, touching upon light matters, shared jokes, childhood memories. But the undercurrent of their struggles still flowed. The weight of their differing worlds, the looming threat of separation, hung in the air like a silent specter. Yet, amidst it all, a resilient strength bloomed, a testament to the connection that defied societal boundaries, a love blossoming amidst adversity, a shared commitment to fight for their future together. The fading light outside cast long shadows, but the warmth emanating from the small apartment felt like a promise of a future where their different worlds could somehow converge. The scent of wood smoke and cinnamon clung to Anya's clothes, a lingering reminder of their quiet evening. She traced the rim of her teacup, the delicate china a stark contrast to the worn, wooden table in Elias's small apartment. The quiet hum of the city outside was a muted backdrop to the turmoil swirling inside her. She hadn't told her family about the pie, about the evening spent laughing over shared memories, about the quiet understanding that blossomed between them despite the chasm separating their worlds. "They called again," Elias said, his voice low, laced with weariness. He leaned back against the worn couch, the springs groaning softly under his weight. The faint scar above his eyebrow twitched slightly. Anya's breath hitched. "Your parents." She knew this fight wouldn't be easy. His past, a dark tapestry woven with hardship and neglect, had cast a long shadow over his life. He nodded, running a hand through his already unruly hair. They don't understand. They can't." His voice cracked, the mask of cynical resilience he'd worn for so long threatening to shatter. The vulnerability in his eyes, raw and unfiltered, made her heart ache. "They don't know you," Anya whispered, the words barely audible above the city's quiet murmur. She reached across the small space separating them, her fingers brushing his. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, a testament to the strength of their bond. He squeezed her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "And you know?" Anya met his gaze, her own eyes welling up. "I do," More than I ever thought possible. She thought about her family, the disapproval simmering beneath their polite facade, the subtle pressure to return to her gilded cage. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by the fierce determination growing within her. And I'm not letting them take this away from us. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken emotions, with the weight of their shared struggle. The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on the walls, highlighting the dust motes suspended in the air. The room, small and humble, felt like a sanctuary, a safe haven from the storm raging outside, a testament to the bond that defied the boundaries of their disparate lives. The scent of cinnamon, a symbol of their unexpected connection, lingered, a promise of the future they were determined to build together. A future where their different worlds wouldn't just converge, but intertwine, forming a powerful, unbreakable tapestry of love and resilience. The mahogany door of Anya's family home felt heavier than usual. The scent of polished wood and expensive flowers did little to soothe the turmoil in her chest. Inside, the hushed voices of her parents were a prelude to the storm brewing. She could almost taste the bitterness of impending conflict. "Anya, we need to talk." Her mother's voice, precise and controlled, cut through the tense silence. Her father sat beside her, his face etched with a weariness that mirrored her own. The opulent drawing room, usually a symbol of comfort, felt like a gilded cage. "I know," Anya replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She met their gazes, the familiar disapproval a cold weight in her stomach. "About Elias," her father sighed, a sound heavy with years of ingrained societal expectations. "He's not suitable, Anya. You know this." "Suitable?" Anya's voice rose, a spark of defiance igniting within her. "He's kind, compassionate, stronger than anyone I know. He rescued me. He's real." The words tumbled out, raw and unfiltered, a stark contrast to the carefully constructed politeness usually employed within these walls. Her mother's expression tightened. "Real? He's from a completely different world, Anya. A world of hardship and instability. This isn't a fairy tale." Anya's breath hitched. The familiar sting of their judgment was sharp, yet something had shifted within her. The fear remained, but it was overshadowed by a deeper, fiercer conviction. She thought of Elias's calloused hands, his quiet strength, the vulnerability he'd shown her in moments of shared intimacy. The cinnamon-scented pie they'd baked together, the laughter shared amidst the flickering candlelight, became vivid memories that resonated far deeper than their societal disapproval. "He's the most real person I've ever met," Anya insisted, her voice filled with a newfound strength. "And I love him." The confession hung in the air, a declaration of war against expectations and tradition. The silence that followed was thick with tension, heavy with the weight of unspoken emotions, the clash of worlds, and the unwavering certainty in Anya's heart. The future remained uncertain, a storm yet to break, but for the first time, Anya felt ready to face it, hand in hand with the man who had shown her the true meaning of strength and resilience. The air in the opulent drawing room crackled with unspoken accusations. Anya's parents, rigid in their silk-covered chairs, seemed statues carved from disapproval. The scent of lilies, usually a comfort, felt suffocating. Anya, however, felt a strange calm settle over her. The initial fear had given way to a steely resolve. She met her father's gaze, his eyes mirroring the weight of generations of expectation. "He's not just different, Father," Anya began, her voice low but firm. "He's shown me things you never could." She traced the rim of her teacup, the delicate china cool against her trembling fingers. The bitter taste of Earl Grey mirrored the bitterness of their judgment. Her mother's sigh was a silken whisper of disdain. "Different is an understatement, Anya. He's rough, unrefined." "He's real," Anya countered, her voice stronger now. "He's honest and he's kind. He's taught me more about strength and resilience than all your charities combined." She thought of Elias's calloused hands gently wiping away a tear during her darkest moments. The memory warmed her, a defiant ember against the icy disapproval. Her father leaned forward, his voice softening slightly. Anya, this isn't just about him.